Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Bergen. He is professor of cognitive science at the University of California, San Diego, in the US. His research interests include language comprehension and production, including grammar, word meaning, metaphor, profanity, and talking while driving. He is also the author of the books Louder Than Words, The New Science of How the Mind Makes Meaning, and What the F, What Swearing Reveals About Our Language, Our Brains, and ourselves. So, Dr. Bergen, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Okay, great. So, I guess that there's a very interesting field developing, I guess, for the past a couple of decades or so that has to do with embodied cognition, that is, thinking about cognition not only centered on our brains or even our nervous system or our higher brain functions, but really trying to understand how the brain is incorporated in a body that is structured in a particular way and interacts with the world in a particular way. So, am I right about that?
That's right. I think that you've, as well as anyone can, captured what people globally agree on when they're using the terms embodied cognition. They may vary a lot in terms of exactly how they think that cognition is embodied and what evidence would be that cognition is embodied. Some people might think that it's sufficient for the body to have been important in the formation of concepts and conceptual structure, that it then gets incorporated into some other sort of representational processing system. Other people think that in order to be truly embodied, you still have to be using parts of the body or parts of the brain that control the body in order to perform other sort of higher order cognitive tasks, and that's a necessary threshold for something to be called embodied. But yes, the general idea is maybe cognition doesn't stop at the frontal lobe or at the brain case, or even with, as you said, the nervous system more generally. Maybe we compute in the sense that cognition is computation. Maybe we compute with our bodies. Maybe we compute with the world, and maybe it's hard to draw a firm line around a particular, piece of tissue or part of the body and say, well, this is where the cognition is happening, but not out here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very interesting because when it comes to cognition, people immediately, I guess most people immediately think about the brain and center on the brain. But we've been finding that there are, at least, for example, by developing some robots, some simple robots that just by the mechanics of them or the way they are organized, the body itself can contain a lot of information or can even remember information about the environment itself, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think that we do this all the time too. We're like those robots. We just don't often notice it. So, in I don't know if you do this, but a lot of Americans don't know what months have how many days, but their knuckles do. So they count January, February, March, April, and so it's the interaction of the body that has a particular structure with an algorithm for interacting with the body while performing this routine. So there's a lot of stuff that happens. Now you can internalize it. You can visualize what your knuckles look like on your fist and counting January, February, March, April. But again, that's using the body to perform calculations, and we do lots of this. So when we're planning action, when we're remembering action, we may activate motor systems. When we're planning behavior and need to compute appropriate trajectories or need to decide what the environment will look like that triggers a particular action, then we may do visual imagery and auditory imagery and so on. And these are all ways that we're using our sensory motor systems to do the things that they're best at in order to, at the highest level, achieve some outcome that the organism wants to achieve.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that when it comes to questions like mind-brain dualism, if we include something like embodied cognition, then that distinction between the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain, becomes even more senseless, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense at all to talk about the brain as being some sort of substance that is sort of floating in the air and that performs some operations that are completely disconnected from the way the body is organized.
I think it doesn't make sense to talk about the brain as discontinuous with the rest of the body. But there, you see the whole range of beliefs about the relationship between mind and physical substance among embodiment proponents that you see for others. So it could very well be that there is a mind and it has its own representational format, and can be understood as distinct. It's still going to be tied in some important way to the body. But whether it can be reduced to the body or not, I think people are a little bit more ambivalent about that.
Oh, okay, I understand. So, and what do you think we would lose if we were to try to study human cognition and exclude, the rest of the body apart from the brain and the nervous system, and so basically excluding the entire field of embodied cognition?
Yeah. I think you'd get a lot of things right. You would be able to make lots of predictions about, in a kind of, you can sort of think of it as in a kind of behaviorist way. Like, you have this, you have this disembodied brain in a vat, and brains are really powerful machines, and they do have lots of structure that develops over development. And so if you were to take such a thing and you were to figure out a way to send it inputs that were as though they were sensory inputs, and you were able to allow it to send outputs that were, you would probably, that sort of thought experiment, you could do a lot. Brains can do a lot. One question is, how would that brain get to be the way that it is? Because of course you don't get a fully formed, say, adult brain without having experience in a body, in a world where that body interacts with the world, and so on. So you'd have to imagine, disembodying a brain that had been embodied to such a point. But in certain ways it would behave very similarly. I think that there are some ways in which it would not behave similarly. One way is that it would have trouble with actual behaviors in the world. So if you like the ones that I was mentioning. So if you disembodied my brain right now, it would take me longer. I would have a harder time, and I would perform different operations trying to tell you how many days June has. I would have a harder time if you disembodied my brain. I would have a harder time. I might or might not be able to do it. To make predictions about the trajectory of a frisbee, where a lot of what I do when I see a frisbee flying, and now I've got to make a prediction about it. Yes, I'm performing, I'm doing naive physics in my head, but I'm also probably using the physical structure of my body to perform that operation, to track the frisbee. And by following the simple rule of tracking the frisbee, that reduces the complexity of the sort of physics predictions I have to make, because I've kept one thing stable, right? I'm keeping the frisbee in the same place in my visual field. So lots of sorts of things that I would have trouble doing. But brains are super powerful things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So one topic that you're very interested in is language. And what
Right.
is the relationship then between embodied cognition and language? What can we get from embodied cognition as some sort of insights about how language works, how we comprehend and acquire and produce language that we wouldn't be able to understand otherwise?
Right. So largely, I think it has to do with learning, and it has to do with meaning. So in the first case, of course, no one would disagree that most of how we learn language is through interactions using our perceptual motor systems. And regardless of the modality, whether it's a signed language or a spoken language, whether it's written forms of language. So I'm going to sort of set that aside because there's basically no debate there. We know that you can't learn language except through using your body. In terms of adult use of language, I think that the most relevant bit has to do with meaning. So there are different accounts of how meaning works, and we can get into the different stories, but at the very least, a good theory of meaning has to be one that allows the successful alignment of speakers and hearers, or writers and readers, or whatever, and in terms of their internal mental states. So I have some objective. I want you to do something or understand something or feel some way, and I'm going to flap my lips for a little while, and some sound waves are going to come out and be transmitted through, to satellites, and they're going to come down and get spit out of your headphones, and something's going to happen in your brain. And so that what happens in your brain has to be some alignment such that you know something new about what I intended for you to feel or know or do. And theories of that range from merely system internal computations of a sort of abstract form, all the way to much more embodied accounts, like the ones that I write about more. Mm-hmm. And so the place that embodiment makes a contribution here is in terms of the fleshing out of the meaning. So if I give you a sentence, if I say I'm sorry my headphones are so huge. I have earbuds, but they have the wrong jack. They have a jack for an iPhone, not a jack for a regular audio port. Okay. That may or may not make sense to you. Hopefully it makes sense to you, because the iPhone has this really annoying jack, right? And you may know about the shape of that jack and the size of that jack and the incompatibility of that jack to the typical audio port in a laptop computer. And so, okay, so how do you understand that sentence? Well, part of how you understand that sentence may be evoking representations that have come through the visual modality of the shape and size of those things, and the experience of those things not fitting together, of jacks not fitting together. Maybe they're motor experiences, maybe they're affective experiences of, being really angry at Steve Jobs for, this being his last, the last way that he cursed humanity by taking away the audio jack in the iPhone, or there's lots of rich information that you have there, from the visual modality, from the motor modality, from affect, from emotion, and that may all go into your understanding of why it is that I have these gigantic cans on my ears, right? That there was an incompatibility of fit of the device that I had, the two devices that I had, and that led me to have to choose something else. And you may even know other things, like you may have some prediction, therefore, about what the end of this wire looks like, right? You know that it's not one of those fat things, it's one of the circular things, right? One of the round things. And you know, therefore, that it can fit into the jack that I described in my computer. So you're making lots of inferences that go beyond the sort of basic compositional meaning of the words of where I describe what jack I have. You make inferences about, okay, it's because of the incompatibility of these two things, but the compatibility of this other, more archaic thing that they would fit together, that electricity would pass through, that I would be able to hear and be able to use it in a conversation. So in terms of the sort of high-level composition of the contributions of meaning of different words and the inferences that you can draw about why I would say the thing that I did and what I meant by it and what consequences it has for why you're looking at what you're looking at, those seem to be derived largely from history of perception, action, and affect. And you may be using that knowledge in real time in language comprehension to be able to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. That's the major contribution that I've written about, is in terms of meaning.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, does that mean that there's a relationship between language and the perceptual, the motor, and the affective systems of our brain? Something like that?
Right. So that's the story. So this is a relatively more narrow kind of embodiment. This isn't, you get dumber when your cell phone is next to you, kind of embodiment. This is this is you use systems of the brain in multiple ways. Some systems of the brain you use for actual motor control, and also for imagery about motor control, and we think also for simulating what it would like to perform actions that are described by language or implied by language, so that you can understand what the language entails.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of like you said, it's kind of, you're using systems of the brain very liberally for a bunch of different functions, including motor control, and to perform computations that allow you to understand what motor control activities would be part of what's described by language.
Mm-hmm. And so that includes doing simulations in our brain, right? And that would lead us to what you call, for example, or you and other people, the embodied simulation hypothesis.
Right. So that's that very same idea. It's the idea that to really succeed in understanding meaning, where language is such a narrow bandwidth, you get a couple words and they're in really strict orders, and the words totally underspecify the actual intent and the detailed meaning. I have a word cat. I don't have 50 words for different kinds of cats, for fat cats and tall cats and hairless cats. I have a word cat. But if we know what cat we're talking about, do you know who Garfield is? Does Garfield exist? Okay, so so if I talk about Garfield, we're talking about Garfield, and I say, well, so the cat jumped off of the windowsill. You know things about the color of the cat; it's orange. You know things about the shape of the cat; it's round. All that stuff has to be filled in by you. And the embodied simulation hypothesis goes that you do fill in that information. Not always, but in many circumstances you do. And when you do so, you use systems of your brain that have evolved to be best equipped to do exactly that. So your vision system happens to be really good at perceiving and then reactivating representations of visual content. And so if you want to have visual information about the cat, then why not use the vision system? You've already got it. It's already tuned for that over millions of years, and millions plus dozens of years, however long you've been alive, both over development and over evolution. That system is really good at doing that. So maybe an efficient way to solve the problem of knowing what the cat looks like in a sentence is to recruit that system to perform some calculations and incorporate that into an ongoing representation of what the meaning is.
Mm-hmm. But all of these systems, I mean, they can be interfered with, right? So, for example, we can, with mental imagery, interfere with how people actually perceive the world, right? For example.
That's right. And so that's one of the key tools that you use experimentally to figure out whether people are using these sensory motor systems, and if so, exactly what they're doing with them. So lots of experiments, and there are important thought leaders in this area who have developed these methods. People like Larry Barcelo and Rolf Zwan, Art Glenberg, are people who have come up with ways to test whether a particular type of simulation is ongoing during language comprehension by either priming it or by interfering with it in different ways. So, but yeah, in principle, if you could interfere with the ability to use your vision system in some particular way, maybe if you could interfere with the ability to activate neurons that reflect orangeness, if you could do that, then maybe you would shift a person's ability to understand the sentence about Garfield just a little bit. You'd make it a little bit harder for them to make inferences about the visual features of Garfield. Maybe not about other features about Garfield, but maybe the visual features of Garfield would be interfered with. And that's sort of the general gist of how these experiments go.
Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting. So we can do experiments that allow for us to understand really what is the precise kind of simulation that is going on people's brains or heads, and that they are using to interpret something, for example.
That's right. So Art Glenberg has a really cool set of experiments that do this. I think they're just a great example of it. So he's interested in motor simulation. Like, are people representing what it would be like to perform described actions? So you handed your brother the keys, or your brother handed you the keys. So if you handed your brother the keys, you would be performing an action where maybe your hand would be going away from your body. If your brother handed you the keys, maybe your hand would be going towards your body. It's the sort of, ultimate action. But are you using your motor system to represent action in each of those directions? And so he's got this cool series of experiments where he fatigues the participant's ability to plan that action. It's sort of like it's a habituation type of experiment. And so he gives subjects this jar with beans in it, a lot of beans, like hundreds and hundreds of dry beans. And their job is to move those beans one bean at a time from the jar onto a plate. So now they're moving beans, and they do this like 600 times. And this is onerous. This is an onerous task. No one likes moving 600 beans one at a time. I don't think it causes any harm to the participants, except boredom, fatigue, frustration. Yeah. Or in another condition, they might be doing it in opposite direction. So they might be moving the beans from away from them towards their body. So they're just moving the same bean. And then after they do this, they get language that they're supposed to process. And that language is, again, language that describes action away from your body or towards your body, where you would move away from or towards your body, and they measure reaction time. And the startling effect is that if you have been habituated to or fatigued at moving your hand away from your body, and then you get a sentence describing action away from your body, you're actually slower to understand that sentence. You might think, well, if it's just about similarity between the actions, you'd be faster. But no, it's as if whatever neurons in your motor system are planning that action, they've become habituated to this sort of baseline activity. Their baseline firing rate is lower. And so when you have to understand a sentence, you have to decide if it makes sense or not. That it takes you longer to decide that a sentence about performing an action in the same direction makes sense, and conversely for actions that are in the opposite direction. So that's the kind of experiment that you would run, and there are others as well. Of course, that's an interference study. It sort of provides strong evidence of the functional role of those systems in that particular task. But there are imaging studies as well, to sort of localize where and when this activity is happening, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating. And let me ask you now, since we're also talking about language. I mean, I think it was the philosopher Jerry Fodor that came up with the concept mentalese, right, to refer to a sort of language of thought that precedes verbal language, let's say, and that probably gives a basis to it, at least according to him. So, I mean, what do you think about this idea of us having a language of mentalese, or something that we have stored in our brain as information that precedes language?
Yeah. I think it's a really complicated idea. So it's clearly a useful idea in certain ways. So if you believe that there's some executive control system that is making decisions, that is selecting over representations, has to use those representations, and where those representations about thought have to interface with lots of other systems that have totally different kinds of operations, that perform them on totally different types of representation. So like if you have a vision system that's just performing operations on colors and edges and movement and stuff like that, and it's got to communicate in some way with a central representational system, then a good solution is to say, well, there's a single representational format that allows for the communication that really does the thinking part, and that is the interface system. I think it's also useful at a sort of a high level of description. We know that we can't explain cognition neuron by neuron, right? Cognition is just far too complex, and there are far too many neurons with behavior that we don't understand, and far too many connections. We don't have the full reduction yet. So even if you believe that full reduction will exist, not to mention the body, even if you feel that you're confident that full reduction will exist, still it's oftentimes useful to have some sort of intermediate level of representation. Some functional level description of what do we think the brain is doing? What's the software like that's running on the hardware of the brain and body? And mentalese, or language of thought, is one such hypothesis about a useful level to describe thought at. All of that said, it seems unlikely to me, just given the diversity of semantics that you see in the world's languages, that all languages get translated into a single common innate internal language. It's also very hard to know how you would test that. It seems largely unfalsifiable, because a language of thought is supposed to be something that is not like any language in that it's not actually expressed. So it's hard to know how to measure it. But to give an example, English segments the world of emotions into a different number of categories than, say, Portuguese does or the Chinese does. It would be hard to make an argument that there is a single right set of emotion concepts in the language of thought, in mentalese, that is, I guess, would have to be the superset of all possible emotion concepts that are expressed in all the languages of the world, and say that each language only selects a subset of those. The problem being, of course, that they overlap in lots of ways. So it would have to be that there's a single set, which is the superset of all possible emotion concepts. So happy in English is kind of like happy in Portuguese, but not exactly, because there are these differences. And so there would have to be two happies in the language of thought, and English happens to pick the English one, and Portuguese happens to pick the Portuguese one. And you could sort of imagine it getting very, very complicated very fast. There's also the problem of fiberglass power boats. There are lots of things in the world that shouldn't have evolved as concepts, because when humans were evolving their brains, at least to the stable point that they've been for the last couple 100,000 years, those artifacts didn't exist. So Fodor takes up the case of fiberglass power boats, speedboats, other things that didn't exist 100,000 years ago, and argues that they must be innate concepts, because concepts in language of thought can't be learned through language or other sorts of things. And that, to me, is very very Fodorian, in that it's extremely controversial and fun, but also patently false. So it seems to me that mentalese is an interesting hypothesis, but I don't see that it generates a lot of sort of advances in research at present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. I understand the complications there, but I guess that there is another idea associated with mentalese, that is, for example, we can have thoughts without language, right? And sometimes we even have thoughts that it's really difficult for us to translate into language. And so there's this sort of idea out there that thought would precede language, that people would be able to think even if they wouldn't have language with them, but maybe then language would facilitate thinking or something like that. And then there's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about how language might influence thought, right? So I mean, about all of those things, what is your opinion? Do you think that language can really strongly influence thought or not?
Yeah. Oh, great. Um, we've seen some evidence that there are ways that people think differently, depending on lots of dimensions of their individual experiences with the world. Um, you know, uh, People think differently about what they can do based on what their bodies can do. Um, uh, People think different about categories based on the sort of the cultural categories that they are exposed to. We see this happening all the time with language, of course, because language imposes category structures. It requires you to do certain things. So in Portuguese, you have to worry about the gender of nouns. Is this a feminine noun or a masculine noun? In English, we don't have to do that. And so, that splits up the world of nouns in Portuguese into these two categories. Now, those are two largely arbitrary categories. In Portuguese, the word for man is male, and the word for is masculine, and the word for woman is feminine. But what about the word for table? Why is the word for table feminine?
Yeah.
Are tables particularly feminine? What about a really big, powerful, strong, like stereotypically male table? Would that then still be feminine, right? Okay, so it seems to be why is a tree masculine in Portuguese? It is, right? It's masculine.
No, it's feminine.
Tree? Tree is?
Yeah, it's feminine. Yeah.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, it's uma árvore. So uma, it's feminine. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I got it wrong. So, and why? It is different from language to language, and these are arbitrary conventions that arise in a language for really complicated reasons. Other languages divide the world in different ways. Some languages divide gender differently, not human gender. Not just in biological gender, not just into male and female, but male, female, and something else. Some languages require every time you count something to put a little marker called a classifier on the number to say what shape it is. So, like Japanese, for example, you have these classifiers. If you're counting cups, you have to use one classifier, two cup-shaped things. If you're counting pieces of paper, it's two flat things.
Yeah.
So those things in language appear to affect how people think conventionally. So the things that people pay attention to when they're perceiving the world, the things that they remember best about scenes in the world, whether they remember who did something, how intentionally they did it. Some languages encode for intentionality, what the shape of the thing was, what the color of the thing was, so on. They seem to influence the category structures that people construct as measured by sort of subjective similarity between things. If you ask people, if you ask Portuguese people whether a tree is more similar to a table, they'll say that a tree is more similar to a table than a tree is to, I'm going to guess it's something masculine, a wall. Is wall masculine?
No, wall is also feminine.
Is everything feminine in Portuguese?
But you could say, for example, a microphone. So
okay,
a microphone in Portuguese is masculine. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so if you have people perform similarity judgments, just ask how similar is a microphone to a tree. People will say not very similar at all, but but people who speak a language where they're in different categories, like Portuguese, will say they're even more dissimilar than people who think for whose languages they're in the same category. So there seem to be lots of effects like this. Now, do those count as profoundly affecting thought, so deeply affecting thought?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know what it counts. Well, I don't know how you measure profundity of effect on thought, but I do know how you can measure their effects on perception, attention, memory, categorization, similarity. And so, in the sort of assemblage of things that we use to measure thought, there seem to be effects in like all of them. So, is it impossible to think a thought that your language doesn't give you? That's sort of the linguistic determinism idea, right? That's the sort of most extreme version.
Yeah.
That also seems pretty unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
There are words in languages that don't exist in my native language that as soon as they're explained to me, I can understand them. Yeah. German has a word Schadenfreude, which is which is happiness at others' misfortune. Um,
Yeah.
that seems like a really useful concept, and as soon as someone explains it to you, you can sort of understand
Mhm.
it. And if that word then gets introduced into your language and you start using it, Schadenfreude, then maybe it becomes as solidified as a concept. Maybe that having a word makes it easier as a concept, easier to access, easier to perceive, easier to remember, and so on. But I'm not sure that having the word limits your ability to think the concept.
Mhm. Yeah, so probably when it comes to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, if there's something to it, probably we would have a weak version of it, right?
That I think that's where the evidence points, right? Clearly, the language you speak affects dimensions of thought, but does not radically constrain possible thought. That seems to be, as far as I can tell, that's where the evidence is pointing.
Yeah, and doesn't constrain completely how you perceive the world, neither.
Right, right. People seem to be able to perceive. I just because I don't have a word for this color doesn't mean I can't perceive it at all. It's going to
Sure.
affect the way that I perceive it and how similar I think it is to other things that I can perceive. But it doesn't. It doesn't shut off my ability to perceive it at all.
Yeah, sure. But then this leads us to an interesting thing that is, so because people experience the world differently and they have specific actions and percepts, I mean, and then they vary by culture, for example, and if meaning is also influenced by how people perceive the world and how they are influenced by their culture, then, I mean, these things, how we think, how we perceive the world, etc., varies from individual to individual and from culture to culture, right?
Sure. Yeah, that follows logically, and there's some evidence that that's true. So if you speak a language that's practiced in a different cultural background where you have different you use your body differently, then you will understand the same language differently. I think about the example of waiting for a bus.
Yeah.
So if you tell me, oh, I was waiting for a bus on the corner, um, I might come up with some image of what that would be like. Now, I've never been to Portugal, but I might imagine that that there are that when you're waiting for a bus, there may be a sign or something uh,
Hmm.
for
Yeah.
a bus, and maybe there are benches.
Yes.
Maybe there are coverings over the benches, so people
Yeah.
stay out of the sun, that sort of thing. Sometimes depends
Sometimes.
on
Yeah.
rural, urban, maybe different. Okay, so I imagine you standing and waiting for the bus. Maybe you're playing on your phone. Maybe I think that when you were waiting for the bus, you were sitting on a bench. Okay, if however, I were someone who grew up in mainland China and was used to people waiting for buses in China, I might be more likely to envision squatting. The way that you wait for buses in China largely is you squat,
Mm.
um, because
Yeah.
that
Yeah. I remember reading about that. Yeah.
right.
That's interesting.
Yeah, in part because maybe the infrastructure isn't there, but also because squatting is just a totally normal, accepted way to be waiting at a place. Whereas in California, you don't see a lot of people squatting while waiting for a bus. They're either sitting or they're standing. Maybe
Yeah.
they're sitting on the curb. They could
Yeah.
be sitting like flat on, but you don't see squatting. So, the exact same sentence, I was waiting for the bus, could evoke totally different ideas of what happened. So maybe I think that your legs should be sore from waiting for a long time if you were squatting versus sitting. Maybe I would. Maybe I think that your clothes are not well suited for squatting. Maybe your clothes are too tight. So I might wonder, well, how could you be waiting for the bus so long with such tight pants? It must have been very uncomfortable if I think that you were squatting. So there are all sorts of different inferences that you might draw based on your cultural background. And then, of course, there are individual differences as well within a culture.
So this also means that people don't simulate things in their heads all the same way. It depends on their personal experiences, and even, I guess, we can introduce here the topic of cognitive capacities, because if I remember correctly, in one of your books, at least, you talk about different cognitive styles that people have. Like, for example, there are verbalizers and visualizers. So, could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. So so people have both different aptitudes to perform particular tasks in particular ways, and they also have different propensities to do so. And this cognitive style idea is about propensity. So if I give you a task and you're going to solve it, you may tend to solve it in one way or another. And the major division that I talk about in the book is visualizing versus verbalizing.
Mm-hmm.
And you can sort of think about it this way. If I give you a task where you're supposed to remember a phone number, so I give you a sequence of numbers, 472-198.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you what those numbers were in 5 seconds, and you do something to rehearse. You could do it in a couple of ways. You could visually activate a representation of those numbers for whatever they were. I've forgotten what they were. 462-098. Let's pretend that's what they were. You might see those numbers in your mind's eye, either see them all together or see them flashing in front of you to get an idea of sequence. If so, you're adopting a visualization solution. Or you might adopt maybe a verbalization solution, which is you say them in your head. Maybe you don't vocalize them overtly, but you think the sounds of the words of the numbers in your head. You think of what it would feel like to say and sound like to hear those numbers. And then that would be a visualization solution. And when you give people tasks like this, you can see by self-report, when you ask them, well, how did you solve this? They report different things. And you can also see that, once again, if you interfere with their ability to do those things, that if they like to visualize and you interfere with visualization by having them do something visual at the same time, they get worse. But the verbalizers don't get that much worse if you have them visualize. The verbalizers get worse if you have them do something else, like say the word "the" over and over and over. Then they forget the numbers. So yeah, people have these different propensities to verbalize and vocalize, and as a result, some people have really high degrees of visualization in lots of tasks, including language comprehension. So there's some people who will hear about someone sitting at a bus stop, waiting at a bus stop, and they will get a really sharp visual image of what that would look like, and lots of visual detail, and maybe even color, and maybe there's a specific person, and maybe there are details of what that person's wearing. They may get lots of rich detail, and other people may get very little. And in fact, about 5% of the population reports having no visual representation at all.
So what they get in their minds is just the word, for example, or the phrase. In that case.
They say it's the words. It's the words.
Yeah, the words. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And that's their self-report. And there's some brain imaging evidence that certain people use their vision systems less when they're performing tasks like this. The same people who report not having visual imagery, and we know that visual imagery is supported, at least in part, by parts of the vision system. Mm-hmm. It seems like there's a lot of variation, and so it's possible that when you're talking across cognitive styles, when a really rich visualizer is talking to a much more preferential verbalizer, maybe some failures to communicate are caused by different beliefs about what the other person must be experiencing through the language that they're sending. Like, how could you not? I said that I was sitting. How could you not infer that my pants were too tight? Right.
Yeah. And that was in fact the next question that I had for you. So, I mean, we've been talking about how language influences our thought, how culture does that, how people have different cognitive styles, like being a verbalizer or a visualizer. So, I mean, at the end of the day, wouldn't it be fair to say that the correct question is not why we misunderstand each other, but how can we even understand each other because of all of these differences, even in terms of the life experiences that we have and that lead to all of these constructs that we develop in our minds? I mean, you understand what I'm saying, right?
Well, so I 100% agree. But I would add on that there's an even better question, which is, do we understand each other? And how can we tell? I mean, certainly we know that we have experiences of understanding. but how do we actually measure success in understanding? I mean, we can do it behaviorally. So in an experiment, you can tell whether one person successfully navigates the other person through a maze using only language, whether the outcome is successful. That's a results-based measurement of successful communication. Is there another? Can we? So surely communication, successful communication, could be, in principle, measured by alignment of the sort of internal states of the speaker and the comprehender, right? I'm thinking of a cat and it's fat and it has stripes and it likes lasagna, and you are thinking about a cat who's fat and has with stripes and likes lasagna, and so and I said a word, and so that's successful communication. That's possible in principle, but we actually don't have a great deal of precision in order to measure exactly what's going on in our respective heads. It's very hard for us to tell, very hard for me to tell that my Garfield is aligned with your Garfield and that in all the relevant ways. So we think, based on behavioral measures, based on sort of outcomes or results-based measures, that oftentimes we're able to successfully communicate. But there are certain theories of psycholinguistics that say that we oftentimes don't at all. So some people say that, our objective in communicating is really not at all to successfully transmit a proposition or a representation or something to another person such that they're aligned, but instead it's just it's some sort of social objective. So it's to align ourselves socially so that you like me and I like you. And that's really the objective. That is what communication is. And if we do that successfully, we've successfully communicated. And for that purpose, we don't actually need to go all the way down to the details of, how fat the cat is and what color its stripes are. All we have to do is agree that we're going to be agreeable, and all of the detailed representations may or may not actually support that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's interesting, and I'm not sure to what extent this is relevant to the discussion we're having here, but there's, I guess, an epistemological theory in philosophy that people call solipsism, right? You might know what I'm talking about here, but basically it says that we can't have access to other people's minds, and we can't really be sure that even other people have minds. And I mean, at least after all that we've talked about here, isn't that at least partially true?
We certainly can't have. We certainly do not have direct access to other people's minds. Now, there's the sort of the moral version of this, like the moral consequences of solipsism that I wouldn't necessarily want to endorse. But yeah, no, we live in intrinsically, we are intrinsically bounded by our own experiences. I think though that rationally we can observe that other humans have similar physiologies to us, that other humans have similar behaviors to us. I think we can reason out that there's a good likelihood that lots of stuff that's happening in your mind and brain and body is similar to what's happening in mine, but that certainly doesn't entail that I have any reason to believe that it aligns or is identical or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, so let me ask you now, we've been talking about simulations, for example, of physical objects. How do we get from those kinds of simulations to abstract concepts? That is, how do we abstract one way up, I guess?
Yeah, so let's go through three possibilities.
Okay.
So one possibility is that we don't. Excuse me. I'm being very embodied today because my kid gave me a cold, so I'm noticing my body a lot. Yeah. So right. One version of the story is that abstract concepts are just different, and we can't know what truth is through any direct physical, emotional experience. it's something that we have to get from language, or I guess from on Fodor's view, it has to be something innate. There's a concept of truth, and it's just a totally different kind of thing. So that's one story. It's very hard to falsify the sort of nativist view. The view that we get it from language is actually quite interesting, and there's work that's been done showing that the way people represent the meanings of abstract words kind of aligns really well with how those words are used in language, more so than concrete words do. So there's some evidence that people are learning a lot about abstract words from language, as you would expect, right? When you learn about truth, you're learning about it in contexts in which people say that a thing is true, and what truth is like, and so on. And so you then have to extrapolate from those situations. Okay, that's one. A second is that you are learning about, over the course of development, you're learning about abstract concepts through concrete concepts that they're described in terms of. And so this is kind of like the idea of pervasive conceptual metaphor. So when we talk about truth, we don't talk about truth in just arbitrary ways. We talk about it in ways that are grounded in physical experiences. So we talk about, and we do this for not just truth, but for lots of abstract stuff, for quantity, for happiness, for numerosity. We talk about all these things in concrete terms. We talk about numbers as objects, where you add numbers together, you put them together. The words that you use are put them together, or take one away in English. And we still say that as adults. And it could be that the way that we learn about these abstract concepts is through concrete ones. That is, we know things about objects and putting them together, and we scaffold our understanding of number and addition and subtraction and so on off of that concrete knowledge, and we continue to use that scaffolding later in life. So even when you're an adult and you're thinking about addition, maybe you are thinking about objects being together, or you're thinking about number lines, or all the other ways that you concretely metaphorize abstract concept. That's version number 2. Version number 3 is maybe you understand abstract concepts in terms of the varied physical situations in which you experience those abstract concepts. So truth, you get an experience of truth when you have an experience of alignment between your beliefs and your observations. So you have a true belief when you believe, I believe that my cup is black. I believe that my cup is black. You have that experience, and then you have a perceptual experience that, fortunately the cup is black. That is truth. Falsity is when those things don't align. And that experience over experiences is could be the basis for the experience of what truth is. There may be other experiences of that ground truth in that same way. So those are 3 different ideas. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think that we learn a lot about truth from language. I think we learn a lot about it from our experiences, and I think that there may be ways that we scaffold it off of concrete things that it's metaphorically described or analogically described in terms of. But yeah, that's the sort of going best story.
And it isn't the case that one of them has more scientific support than the others at the moment?
As a general solution, no. I think that there's confirmatory support for. There's the most confirmatory support for there being metaphorical bases for continuing cognition about abstract concept. We've done a lot of that work in my lab, and lots of other labs have done fantastic work. Lara Boroditsky, who's my colleague, has been a pioneer in that for a long time. Ray Gibbs, and many others have done fantastic work on showing that, even when you're merely thinking about happiness, you look up more, because we talk about happiness is up, like you're feeling up versus feeling down. Even if you're merely thinking about the future, you orient towards the front, because we talk about the future as ahead. And so there are these, that seems, there's kind of lots of evidence for that, and that's not just linguistic evidence, that's evidence about cognition more generally. There's lots of evidence for that. There's burgeoning evidence for the extraction from language story, that we use sort of statistical evidence from how the words are used in the language in general. As computation gets more powerful, these language models that we now have become more powerful, we're able to see exactly how much information is contained in the language around us about the words that we know. And so you can start to ask, well, how much of human knowledge about these words could in principle come from exposure to language? And there's more and more evidence about that. Yeah. There isn't really any knockdown evidence against any of them at present.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now let's go for the last, and I guess one of the $1 million questions.
Sure.
So we've been talking about embodied simulation, but
yes.
There's a question that we've been missing, I guess. What is it really good for? I mean, why do we have embodied simulation? And I mean, why can't we exist exactly the same without having embodied simulation?
Right. Well, one way to think about it is that it provides a utility advantage. If you think about what's hypothesized to be going on in simulation, people are hypothesized to be using their vision systems to construct visual scenes to allow them to understand and perform inferences about what others are saying and writing. They're using their motor systems to construct motor inferences of what it would be like to reach out and grab a set of keys so that they can again perform inferences and so on. So one way to answer, what's the benefit, is that the benefit may be efficiency. Those systems, as I mentioned earlier, we know have been tuned over the course of primate and mammalian human evolution to be really good at making predictions about what something will feel like or what something will look like, to facilitate behaviors. And if you had to perform those inferences in some other way, it might be far less efficient. So imagine now that that everything you know about what things look like, you have to re-represent in some other internal system, some other format. You've got to come up with a system for representing what things look like, but it can't be the vision system. Mm-hmm. How would you do it? Well, you could just copy the vision system. You could have one-to-one connections between every neuron here and every neuron there. Now you have the vision system prime, which is just the internal. Okay, so that doesn't seem super efficient. Nor does it seem like the type of thing that neural systems evolved to do. Or you could transform it into some other format. So you could transmute it into like a language of thought or something like that. Mm-hmm. That wouldn't be a very good system for making visual inferences, because visual inferences, does a thing shaped like this fit into a thing like this? I mean, those are judgment calls that you're best able to solve by doing visual comparison, the size and shape of one thing versus the size and shape of the other thing. If you had to write propositions, let's say, or had to tune a neural network, say, to be able to perform those operations, it would be a lot of work to do that. And it's not clear what advantage it would give you to do that transduction into a different system in the first place. So in a sense, it seems like for the purpose of performing inferences, for the purposes of fleshing out what someone means in order to be able to act on it, in order to be able to understand the next sentence, which may depend on you having a deep understanding, in order to be able to anticipate what a person is going to say next, it seems like these other systems get recruited to perform a little bit of calculation, to allow the organism to respond optimally and most efficiently. So I think without it, it would be a decrease in specificity of representation, inability to predict the future, inability to perform inferences and be able to understand what a person really meant or why they said it. I think those would be the drawbacks. And as you said, with language, we really want to know not why do we sometimes fail to understand each other, but how do we ever understand each other? And I think that simulation actually provides a large part, and inference more generally, is a large part of the answer to how we're ever able to understand one another. the word cat could mean so many different things. In English, it could refer to a house cat. It could refer to a lion or a tiger. It could refer to a particular brand of construction vehicle, and or many other things. It could be a woman's name. There are all kinds of things that it could be. And in context, by constraining what you think the language is about and using systems for perception, action, and so on, you're able to limit the uncertainty so that the parts of your brain that are good at putting together the pieces of the pieces of words and the words into sentences can do their job most effectively and not have to solve these really huge problems of what kind of thing is a cat and what color is it and so on. Mm-hmm. So in a way, they're there to they're there to facilitate communication surrounding a language that is radically underspecified.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just ask you this before we go. At the beginning, when we were referring to embodied cognition, I gave the example of some robots that people use for them to better understand the way by which how a body is structured might influence how the organism behaves and the kinds of information from the environment that it is able to store just in its mechanics, let's say. But we can also go the other way around, right? By studying embodied simulation and embodied cognition in humans, it can also give us tools and knowledge to build or construct new AI systems that perform better, right?
That's the idea. In practice, solving embodied simulation is a very hard thing, right? Because you have to be able to represent objects in the world. You have to solve motor control and vision. And in the general case, that's very hard for humans. So really what we've seen so far is sort of very small scale implementations. If you implement a particular bit of simulation for a particular domain, mm-hmm. does that facilitate inference, language comprehension, language generation, and so on? The answer there is that it's quite promising. Right now, in terms of the sort of top-of-the-line AI systems, language models are most successful when they just use a brute force method, right? It's just superficial language all the way down, and that will be true to a point. But there will be a point where you just don't have enough data to be able to predict what a person can anticipate. So there's an old example. This is a paper by Art Glenberg where he asks people to make judgments about the likelihood of a particular sentence. So in context, so it could be something like Susan forgot her pillow when she went camping, so she filled a sweater with a bunch of leaves.
Yeah.
Okay, should make sense. And compare that with the sentence, Susan forgot her pillow when she went camping, so she filled a sweater with a bunch of rocks. Okay, so for a human, there's a big difference between those two sentences in terms of comprehensibility. We can see an N400 fire in your brain. Your brain goes all crazy when you get to rocks versus when you get to leaves. Yeah. It may be that there's no amount of training on Wikipedia and the entire web or anything like that will ever allow a language model to make that same prediction, or to know why one is less likely than the other, or to make inferences about how Susan would feel the next day and whether to expect black and blue marks on her head and face in one case or the other. Those are things that may never be achievable by just scaling up and just using language statistics, and that are going to have to be solvable using something like simulation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Bergen, let's end the interview here. Before we go, would you like to tell people what are the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
Yeah, so I'm a dinosaur. I don't have any social media, anything. You can find me at the UC San Diego Cognitive Science Department. I have a web page there that lists all my things. And this has been a fantastic interview, and I really appreciate it, Ricardo. I think there have been some other interviews with far less detail and far less interest, but about other topics that I work on, including profanity and other things that they can find on my webpage as well.
Yeah. Probably one of these days we can gather together again to do an interview on your other book, What the F, right? Because I also read it, but I mean the interview was already so long that I really had to cut that part out, so unfortunately. But anyway, I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview and also to your books so that people can go and read them if they want. They are very interesting. And Dr. Bergen, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to have you on.
It's been really fun. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, you can also help me through PayPal. And if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Brian Rivera, Sergio Condreano, Iane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Doctors Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart. My 4 producers, Isar Webe, Rosie, Jim Frank, and Lucas Stafiniak, and finally my executive producer, Michal Ruzieski. Thank you for all.